So great to be here. How's everybody doing? You know you're at a school of philosophy and theology when you still have an attentive audience at the end of a 90-minute panel. So thank you for the invitation to be here. Thanks in particular to John Denniston, who's my link to this particular gathering. And I want to thank Paulo in particular for his remarks. I think what I'll share with you this morning is in large part really builds on some of Paulo's remarks. And like Paulo, I offer these remarks not as someone with any formal training in philosophy and theology, nor even a very solid theoretical framework for matters pertaining to the role of the laity in the church today. I speak mostly from experience. I'm a practitioner who has dedicated her career to pulling the levers of policy, entrepreneurship, and investment in an attempt to contribute to a greater human flourishing. So I would consider myself a very spiritually rooted person with deep formation in Catholic social teaching, largely through my participation in the Focolare Movement, which was mentioned earlier today. And I would consider myself a part of this great big body of the laity. I also offer these remarks in the spirit of someone who is deeply interested in and committed to participation in co-creation with the divine, finding value in spaces that are often overlooked, in an endlessly creative act of trying to make matters on earth more as they are in heaven. And what I'd like to do in this brief period is share some reflections on what I believe is a very ripe opportunity to harness the creative act of entrepreneurship, in particular, as a space for our personal and collective spiritual transformation, and as fertile ground for the integration of faith in daily life. And for this group today, I'd like to try and open up a dialogue by asking or offering three particular questions for our collective reflection. But first, I see evidence of a real thirst among innovators, particularly aspiring entrepreneurs that I get to interact with in my daily work, to participate in what I would call principled innovation through the act of entrepreneurship. And I really believe that the church, with its rich reservoir of philosophical and theological tradition, and tradition with a capital T, could be, and in many ways already is, a center for formation in principles that can guide those entrepreneurs in building companies and organizations that promote the good of communities and of our planet. So the first question that I'd propose for us is, how can the laity leverage church teaching to form principled entrepreneurs and innovators? Second, I believe the laity have a significant contribution to make in harnessing the broader institutional assets of the church, whether that's our real estate, financial, social, or intellectual capital, and the resources of religion more broadly on behalf of that principled entrepreneurship. And so the second question I'd ask is, how can the laity actively harness those assets to advance this kind of principled entrepreneurship? And finally, I believe the laity have an opportunity to self-organize in new and very creative ways to integrate faith and work life, and today is the moment to engage in those endeavors. So the third question then, and we'll go back to each of these, is how can the laity actively form new kinds of community and new spaces that better integrate spiritual and entrepreneurial lives? So let me go back to my first question. How can we leverage the rich tradition of the church to form principled entrepreneurs and innovators? Everywhere I go, I'm seeing signs of a growing openness to the idea that we need more entrepreneurs and people in business broadly who are well-formed in ethics, philosophy, and theology. There is no such thing as a view from nowhere, and for those of us seeking to lead lives of meaning, we must discern our principles and remain grounded in them. My own professional journey has been shaped by a view of entrepreneurship as a space that's ripe for all of us to lead in ushering forth the tradition of the church in all of its evolving manifestations. And this is thanks largely to my formation in Catholic social thought, which has, as I mentioned, been taken place principally through my participation in Focolare Movement. Focolare is a word in Italian that means hearth or fireplace. It's meant to evoke a familial spirit. The Focolare Movement, as Paulo mentioned, is an ecclesial movement. It was born in the Catholic Church, and its spirituality has been called, in particular, the spirituality of union or of unity or communion. It came to life in northern Italy amidst the destruction and the devastation of World War II. Huddled in bomb shelters where they were called many times a day, Chiara Lubich, the founder of this movement, a young woman in her early 20s, and a group of her young friends began to read the gospel by candlelight and experience the immense personal love of God for each of them, despite losing what they felt they valued most at that time. They realized that the words that they were reading in Scripture seemed to them to be words of life, meant that they were something that could be actively lived as a response to God's love. And they came across the prayer of Jesus the night before he died, "Father, may they all be one," and they understood that they were especially born to manifest that in the world. So to live and work for a united world. That's a particular charism of the Focolare that was mentioned by Paolo. My participation in Focolare was extensive in my teen and early adult years. I participated in local meetings in communities around the country, ranging from what we called word of life meetings, where we would take a particular verse or particular passage of Scripture and share experiences of how we were putting that into practice in day-to-day life, to something called a Sports for Peace weekend, where my inner sort of athlete and jock got to play games and activities where we talked about living gospel values through sports. So a very particular kind of personal, authentic encounter for me growing up. I traveled to international gatherings, including a March for Peace in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I spent a year living in an established international community of the Focolare in Lopiano, Italy, where I spent all of my time intentionally focused on living what the movement called an art of loving, which was animated by the gospel. These experiences had a very profound impact on my professional choices in my pathway. I began my career in the field of microfinance, providing loans to help lower income, primarily immigrant entrepreneurs, access capital and build businesses that could sustain them and their families. And previously, as an undergraduate student of economics and political science, I felt compelled to participate in some evolution of this homo economicus to a homo cooperativus, or basically a shift from a self-interested pursuit of power and wealth to a market marked by relationality, by communion, the dignity of work, and the preferential option for those on the margins of current power structures. Microfinance seemed like a good place to start in its noble pursuit of harnessing private capital markets to broaden participation in the economy, offering more individuals access to resources that could prove pivotal in their ability to create something that was both sustaining and dignifying. My understanding of how the creative act of entrepreneurship can be transformational has continued to evolve. I spent 3 years working in Michigan to build a company that worked with the state, corporate, and philanthropic actors to identify and invest in entrepreneurs that could provide work for those who had been chronically displaced by the Great Recession and were struggling to re-enter the labor market. And today I spend my time identifying and making early-stage investments in companies that have developed some sort of product, service, or technology dedicated to creating pathways in education and work, primarily for those who are underserved. Perhaps the most formative component of my journey with the Focolare has been my involvement with an initiative called the Economy of Communion, which again, Paolo had mentioned. I'm going to call it EOC for short. It's an initiative that began in the Focolare, whose collective lifestyle really proved to be fertile ground for manifesting that prayer for unity that I mentioned in various fields of endeavor, including in business and economics. We actually call it the Economy of Communion and Freedom, which I think is really interesting given some of the earlier remarks, because it's a freedom realized in relationship with the other. So in 1990, the Focolare's founder, Chiara Lubich, traveled to Brazil to meet with members of the local community there, and she was totally captivated by this stark contrast between the skyscrapers and the favelas, not too dissimilar from what we see in many US cities today, even walking around downtown San Francisco, might I say. So she called upon innovators and entrepreneurs to start companies that would commit to building sustainable businesses that would embody the values of the gospel in their everyday affairs, and how those companies hired, how they bid for projects, how they paid taxes ethically, how they created supportive working environments, and on and on and on. And these companies were called to place a portion of their profits in common. So businesses were to share those profits, both to support those in need, as well as to contribute to education programs that were focused on building businesses according to an ethos of a culture of giving. I just want to read you how we describe the culture of giving online with the economy of communion, because I think it's really striking. There is a giving that is self-interested or utilitarian, found in some sort of neoliberal tendencies that always seek their own advantage. And then there's a giving that we find in the Gospels. In this giving, the giver opens up to the other person and remains respectful of their dignity. It generates an experience of the words in the gospel, give and it will be given to you, even for managers of a company. These words from the gospel might manifest themselves to a business person in the form of financial windfall or in the unexpected discovery of an innovative technical solution or as an idea for a winning product. Chiara seemed to intuit that it wasn't enough to just build one of these businesses committed to living the gospel, but that we needed efforts to change how business is done systemically. So the EOC today includes entrepreneurs, workers, citizens, scholars, students, organizations, and people in need. Its purpose is to contribute to eliminating poverty by sharing needs and resources in a mutual act. Notice the mutuality in that. I can't offer a resource unless you offer a need. And it really is meant to build a more just and humane market economy and a society in which no one is in need. So over the last 29 years, the EOC has matured, it's spread throughout the world, it's built some remarkable things. Over 300 dissertations have been written about the economy of communion, and several universities have adopted it as a case study or as the guiding curriculum, essentially, for their business schools, from the Cameroon to St. Paul, Minnesota. In his 2009 encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI acknowledged the EOC as a broad new composite reality embracing the private and public spheres, one which does not exclude profit, but instead considers it as a means for achieving human and social ends. With that impetus, the EOC has entered a new phase of dialogue with civil society and other organizations in its effort to eradicate poverty and create a more humane economy. So a question for us, like the EOC has done with its roots in Catholic social teaching and the gospel, how might we form entrepreneurs rooted in principles that are inspired by their faith? I do believe that Catholic social teaching is especially fertile ground for doing so. It already demands that we replace the idolatry of the market and efficiency and shareholder profit in favor of a preference for the vulnerable and the good of authentic, life-giving relationships. Second, we might ask, how can the laity harness the assets of the church to advance that kind of entrepreneurship and the structures to support it? According to a 2016 study that I came across at Georgetown, it's called the SocioEconomic Contribution of Religion to American Society. Religion broadly is a significant source of America's economic and social strength, annually contributing about $1.2 trillion of socioeconomic value to the US economy. That is equivalent to being the world's 15th largest national economy. And since we're in Silicon Valley, or at least next door, I'll note that it's more than the global annual revenues of the world's top 10 tech companies, including Amazon, Apple, and Google combined. So you could say there's a lot of spiritually inspired dollars being pumped into the US economy. There's been real progress made around strategies to, quote, negatively screen assets that are held by religious institutions and households to ensure, for example, that a religious order isn't invested in tobacco or in an industry that is significantly furthering environmental degradation, as that allocation of assets might stand in direct contradiction to the values that they seek to espouse. But today, there appears to be a real thirst to take a more proactive stance and identify opportunities to pursue good, not just avoid the negative. I recently joined a working group of the Catholic Impact Investing Collaborative, a network of wealth managers, investors, and others focused on designing principles to help guide this work around the assets of the church. Our three core principles, as articulated today, are that first, we believe that as Catholic individuals and institutions, we have a moral obligation to work for a more just society. Second, we believe that we must pursue that aim with urgency. Third, we believe that financial investments can not only provide financial resources to help achieve a more just society, but that the investments themselves can help further that vision by creating positive social and environmental impacts. We are asking a question: how might we better and more proactively invest in principled entrepreneurs with a deep formation in their faith? In today's world, in which religion is by far the biggest business, I think spiritual entrepreneurs are often on the outside looking in. They have limited access to the intellectual and financial resources that might enable their ventures to serve the growing populations of those who seek new forms of engagement with their faith and spirituality. I think we can do more and we can do better. One strategy to support this work would be to engage in forming new kinds of communities and spaces that better support these efforts to integrate faith and work lives. Person by person, iteration by iteration, I have been fortunate to have helped develop or experience new efforts to do this. Whether it's serving on a committee to help a Swedenborgian church in Washington, D.C. build a co-working space for spiritual entrepreneurs, or co-working myself on the top floor of an Episcopal church in Los Angeles that has dedicated half of its space to freelancers and entrepreneurs who want to do their work in an environment of what they call modern monasticism. The economy of communion has started incubators in countries around the world where they train entrepreneurs to think big, test small, listen attentively to all their stakeholders, privilege relationships over all else, and remain rooted in the gospel. Other faith traditions have also been pioneering in this space. Glean is an incubator born out of the Jewish tradition that provides a 12-week intensive entrepreneurship program combined with a certification in spiritual entrepreneurship. In their words, our hope is that our own shared gleanings will equip a generation of spiritual entrepreneurs to more wholeheartedly love the problems they're trying to solve, the constituencies they aim to serve, and the world they dream of bettering. How might we spark modern, new manifestations of collaborative work arrangements, new business structured, and principled leaders that invite all people in and help all people contribute to their own and others' human flourishing? So to conclude, I believe entrepreneurial endeavors can play a central role in advancing and protecting the principles distilled through Catholic social teaching, particularly when it comes to lifting up the poor. The laity, we might say, have a moral duty to increase opportunities for the poor to provide for themselves and their families through dignified work. Such co-creation is a direct reflection of God. Pope Francis wrote, "Business must serve the common good by striving to increase the goods of this world and to make them more accessible to all." I think we can respond to this challenge by not only taking up entrepreneurship as a noble calling, producing wealth and improving the world, but also by forming entrepreneurs, harnessing the assets of our church in new ways, and building communities that nourish those efforts. In so doing, I believe we can, as was mentioned at the beginning, harness the creative act, the art, the craft of entrepreneurship as a space for personal and collective spiritual transformation, and as fertile ground for the integration of our faith in daily life. Thank you.